Welcome back to the third video in the series about Chapter 15, looking at inflation, unemployment, and monetary policy. So jumping back to where we had been, we left off in this place, on this spot. We're talking about aggregate demand and inflation. If prices can change, how might the price level affect aggregate demand? So, excuse me. Up until now, we've been assuming that firms were not operating at full capacity, and therefore the price level could not change. So suppose we relax that assumption. Suppose we allow for the fact that firms' costs may change, leading to a potential change in the price level. Well, just as with a standard demand curve, we're going to expect a downward slope. We're going to expect that at higher price levels, people are going to buy fewer goods and services, and at lower price levels, they are going to buy higher quantities of goods and services. It doesn't matter if we're talking about all goods and services in an economy, or we're talking about a specific industry, or we're talking about a specific product. The relation should still hold. Where this comes in is when we subsequently think about the effect of a change in the costs for firms and the prices that they are likely to charge. So this brings into play the challenge for policymakers. How should policymakers navigate their competing interests to limit inflation, to try to keep price levels from rising too much, versus decreasing the unemployment rate? And when we think about how policymakers tend to prioritize these things, there are two key elements here. One is thinking about the state of unemployment. Is unemployment dramatically higher than policymakers believe it should be? And two, what is the actual likelihood of inflation in the presence of spending policy? So it's possible that if unemployment is really, really low, extra spending could presumably lead to a greater risk of inflation. If there's really low unemployment and workers are highly likely to strike or now argue for higher wages, suddenly the likelihood of inflation is greater in the presence of spending or in the presence of other policies meant to encourage spending. On the other hand, if unemployment is really, really high and workers feel very precariously employed if they still have work, we're going to expect less bargaining. We're going to expect less lobbying on behalf of workers for higher wages, and there's going to be substantially lower risk of inflation because workers are just less likely to argue for or to secure higher wages. So, supply shocks and inflation. Supply shocks are factors that change production costs independent of demand. So anything that increases the cost of producing goods and services could theoretically affect aggregate supply of goods and services. And broadly speaking, they're different from demand shocks because they affect producers. What does a negative supply shock look like when we think about equilibrium income? Well, if there's a rise in production costs, we're going to expect a decrease in aggregate supply, and this should lead to an increase in the aggregate price level and a decrease in the equilibrium income level. We're going to skip this, skip thinking about how to visualize the supply shock, and we're skipping the Phillips curve as a whole, and jumping ahead. Okay, so on the left of this slide, I've shown what you would expect an increase in energy prices to do to aggregate supply. So we're leaning in on the tricky notation and using a capital Y to represent GDP, aggregate demand, and aggregate supply. Our downward sloping curve is our aggregate demand curve, and our upward sloping curve is our aggregate supply curve. Now, suppose there is an increase in energy prices. Well, all firms are likely to use energy, so we're going to expect this to lead to a decrease in supply. This is going to be a leftward shift of our aggregate supply curve. Firms produce less output and they charge higher prices of it for it. It's worth noting that we're in the middle of basically the complete opposite right now, as oil prices plummet into the negative range. But we're talking about an increase in energy prices. So if you have an increase in energy prices, we have a leftward shift of our aggregate supply curve. And all else equal, we're going to expect a rise in prices and a decrease in the quantity of goods and services that households can actually purchase, which will have implications for income, and thus both income will fall and price levels will rise. How do we map that in our graph of the employment model? Well, we're talking about prices, so that should direct your attention to the price setting curve. And we're going to expect a downward shift. As the price level rises, as the denominator of the price setting curve gets bigger, we have a downward shift of our price setting curve. And all else equal, we're eventually going to end up at this lower equilibrium employment level. So, does your average household or firm object to slow and steady inflation? I'm going to leave it to you to read about this in the textbook, but empirical findings seem to indicate that households don't tend to mind slow, steady inflation. This doesn't hold if they're on a fixed income. So anyone who is retired who gets the same income regardless of what's happening in the marketplace will be very negatively affected by inflation. But in practice, no, slow, steady inflation doesn't tend to bother your average household or firm. But sudden shocks are quite another story. So a sudden increase in inflation above what people are expecting can be a very jarring experience. So do monetary officials try to prevent inflation at all costs, or do they try to stabilize it at a particular level? Effectively, policymakers in the US try to stabilize inflation at a particular level. And the rate in the US, the target inflation rate, is 2%. Okay, monetary policy and inflation versus unemployment. Monetary policy is designed to encourage or discourage borrowing through the use of the interest rate. An increase in interest rates discourages borrowing, which should decrease investment expenditure, and all else equal should lead to a decrease in equilibrium income, which we assume is going to push unemployment up. And we're going to expect the opposite in an expansionary story. A decrease in interest rates leads to an increase in investment expenditure, which leads to an increase in equilibrium income output demand, as well as an increase in the aggregate price level. We're skipping section 15.9 and ending with this slide here. Recessions and monetary policy. When an economy goes into recession, how is a central bank supposed to help? Well, it can lower interest rates or encourage or increase the money supply. And again, when the central bank lowers interest rates, that encourages borrowing in order to reverse